Hi everyone, welcome to another episode of the Cheeky Natives, coming to you all the way from Johannesburg. I have a very special guest on today's show. Her name is Zinzi Clemmons. She actually doesn't need an introduction, but I'll do one anyway because she's just so great. She was raised in Philadelphia to a South African mother and an American father. She then co-founded the literary journal Apogee in 2011. Her debut novel, which is what we have the honor of discussing today, What We Lose, was a finalist for the Carnegie Medal, the Aspen Words Literary Prize, and the National Book Critics Circle Leonard Prize. In 2017, she was the National Book Award 5 Under 35 honoree. Zinzi currently teaches writing at the Occidental College in Los Angeles, and she's here in South Africa to launch her book, which has had an amazing reception worldwide. Lots and lots of people have been able to relate to this book. Welcome to the Cheeky Natives, Zinzi.
Thank you. I'm glad to be here.
So you wrote What We Lose, and before we get into the book, I'm always curious about writers and the process behind it, and sort of your literary influences, because I always just think that it's interesting to find out who writers are reading and who they've read. Mm-hmm. So Zinzi, why do you write? Why are you a writer? I know that you had an interesting journey, and I'm hoping you'll tell us a little bit about how you became a writer, but why do you write?
I write because I have to, I'd say, As you mentioned, when I was younger, I wanted to be a doctor, partly because I like science and partly because I wanted to please my parents, like most, a lot of us. As I sort of went along and I got to college, when I was younger, in college, I was pre-med, and I just sort of realized I couldn't do it anymore because I just didn't find it interesting enough to hold my attention for that much time, and I didn't feel passionate about it, so I started taking literature classes. I took a creative writing class kind of on a whim, and I wrote a story, and I just really loved it. I loved writing it. I loved being able to express myself fully, and then I loved afterwards talking with my classmates and with my teachers about writing. And ever since then, it was just I haven't stopped.
You've said in a previous interview that your time at Brown University was the turning point for your writing.
Yeah.
What was so significant about your time there?
Well, that was when it happened. That was where I first started writing. And I think in particular the environment at Brown, it's a very artsy, sort of free thinking school, and they let you do whatever you want, and the creative writing classes are particularly free, they have more of an sort of experimental sort of leaning in terms of aesthetics. And so I was reading things from everything from traditional short stories Flannery O'Connor to the most experimental things I started reading Maggie Nelson when I was in college, and just all kinds of writers that people have never heard of, and just being exposed to such a wide array of writers. I was also working quite a bit in the African Studies department. It was just really freeing to feel like I didn't have to write in a certain way, and it really kind of sparked me.
Is there a moment, I always ask writers this, it's interesting, for some people it's when their first book is published, and for some people it's when they write their first story in high school, but what was the moment in which you felt like a writer? You felt like this is it?
It was probably when I had my first story published. I published a couple of short stories. The first one is actually sort of incorporated into What We Lose. It's part of the basis. It was when I was writing a story about my mother and our relationship, and that's made its way into the book. And when I had that published, it actually wasn't my first story published, but it was my first like significant one, because I published on some online outlets, but for this one, it was accepted by a journal called Transition, which is the publication of Harvard's W.E.B. Du Bois Center for African American Studies. And so this is where Henry Louis Gates Jr. works, and other amazing Black intellectuals and thinkers. And I had always really looked up to that publication and admired the people who came out of it. And to have a story accepted there meant so much to me. And I think it was that validation that allowed me to say, like, I'm actually doing this, and it's not just in my head. Yeah.
So this is quite an intimate and very personal novel, and we'll get into it a little bit later. But in writing it, what did you learn about yourself? Because you wrote it and then you read it afterwards, and were you just like, well then?
Well, I think, I learned a lot in the process of writing it too. Because for me, this was like, it's autofiction. It came out of a real experience. And that real experience was going through the process of grief and loss. And writing the book for me was about doing research, about reading, about recording my own experiences. And through all of that, I really learned a lot about how humans process grief, what is harmful, what is helpful, how different types of people process grief, and how different structural issues sort of affect that process. And it just allowed me to see a lot about something that I didn't formally know about. I think there's probably another side of it that's happened in sharing the book and going to events, and you have people that say things, like point things out about it that you didn't notice. Like last night I did a reading in Rosebank, and I had someone ask a question, and it was like, it was something like, I worried about Tanvi's mental health. And I obviously, she's going through this thing, and she's in a sort of fragile state. So obviously I was concerned about, it's her state of mind, but I hadn't thought of it in terms of maybe mental illness and how that might be a part of it. Or maybe just hadn't thought about it long enough. And then when you have people point things out like that, and they notice things that you haven't, sometimes it sort of like fills something in your mind, and like, oh yeah, that is right.
So I'm quite curious. Some writers don't necessarily voice their personal politics. They're quite they feel like there should be a distinction between their writing and their personal politics, and they should just refrain from, gathering attention. You don't feel that way at all. Is there a reason why you feel so strongly about being vocal about your politics outside of just the literary world?
Yeah, that's really how I was raised. A lot of it is about my connection to this country. My mother was active in anti-apartheid. When she moved over to the States, she carried a lot of that with her. She left some of the action behind. She and my father as well, they both taught us about, what happened. They taught us about, some of the effects, a lot of the effects of apartheid and how they were harmful, and they just named it. Racism was something that was talked about in our home. And it was always a part of the conversation, and then really coming here as well, because I've been coming to South Africa and spending a lot of time here since '85.
Sure.
Yeah, and so I saw really like a really transitional moment, and that's a part of my childhood. Like one of my most vivid memories is going with my mother to vote in '94 in Philadelphia, because they had for expats, they had a voting center set up. And, things like that, just seeing things like that my entire life, it's just always been a part of who I am. Yeah.
So you published a really interesting essay, and I know I spoke about this essay at the launch, but I thought it was interesting that you spoke about how America's idea of the literary vanguard excludes black writers, and I think an interesting journey that we're undertaking is seeing black people take up space that they previously didn't occupy. Do you feel as strongly about that essay now, having published your book, than you did when you first wrote this? Because I mean, the essay was the precursor to the book.
Right. Unfortunately, I do. You know, I think something like that is going to take a long while to address. But I think since that essay came out, one thing that I think has been different is the emergence of certain writers. And, you know, you can't peg the success of an entire community to one or two people. So it's inappropriate to say that, like, things are changing or they're different. But the success of people like Claudia Rankine, even Paul Beatty, you know, who's my mentor and a wonderful person, but people who are writing, in Claudia Rankine's case, experimenting heavily with form, she's being recognized more. Paul Beatty, you know, I think it's more about his point of view and subjectivity and his views on race that are different from maybe what we might be used to. And I see more space being created for them, but I think what will probably need to happen is that, you know, in our literary history, there are a lot of people who come before and have not gotten that recognition. And so in order for things to feel different, I think we would need to look back at the other people on that list, and they would also have to be prominent as well.
So you cited Claudia Rankine and Toni Morrison as literary influences. Who else has influenced your writing? And as a follow-up to that question, is there a book that you wish you had written? You read this book and it changed your life, and you just... I have lots of books like that. And I'm like, why didn't I write this? Yeah. But I'm exempt because I don't do I'm not a participant in the arts of writing, which really is an art that I don't think people fully appreciate.
Let's see. Influences, I also, you know, a lot of those experimental writers that I kind of mentioned, again, Maggie Nelson was a big influence. You know, some people that nobody has heard of even.
This is their moment.
Is their moment? Okay, let's see. There was a book that I read early on called I Remember by the writer Joe Brainerd, who's a visual artist and a poet. And it's just all composed of phrases that start with I remember. And so that also works in a vignette form. And it's basically like it reads as an autobiography because it says I remember, and then you have all these memories, right? And so you're looking at the memories to learn about the person. Lydia Davis also is a big influence. You know, in regards to the second question, probably the first. I'm also a critic. I'm a very critical person. So in college, I studied writing and literature. I also studied critical theory. And I studied, you know, deconstructionism and all of these things that really encourage you to think critically. And so I'm really never someone who's held up works of literature as completely perfect. I'm always kind of looking for the gaps. And I think it would be difficult for me to write if I didn't think that way, or at least to write as freely, you know, because I feel like there's always something that can be done better.
And does that not like cripple you when it comes to writing? So you're writing, but you constantly feel like there's stuff that you can do better. Does that not cripple? Maybe cripple is not the right word, but does that not make writing a little bit more intimidating for you, the process?
It can, yeah, and I don't think cripple is an inappropriate word. Sometimes it can be that way, you know, and I think writing is, you have to mitigate your own brain and your own impulses in order to just keep doing it, because the endeavor of writing is so fruitless. If you thought about how pointless it was to write a book whenever you were doing it, you wouldn't do it, because the likelihood is it's not going to get published, or if it does, it's not going to make money. So you kind of have to live in this dream world where things can happen. And I do have to fight back that voice that says this is never going to be good. But I see that as a big part of my job as a writer.
So the book is What We Lose, and it's, when I was reading it, I felt that it was quite a personal meditation on loss and on grieving and on coming to terms with mortality and with imperfect relationships. And I'm curious, I mean, this was based on a very tragic event in your life, and I don't imagine that writing it at that time was easy. How did you go on with writing something that was based on something that was so intensely personal and so tragic?
Yeah, well, first of all, I had always written about my mother. Like, those were some of the first stories that I wrote in college, and just like exploring our relationship, because it was extremely fraught. And sometimes it would be, not so different from nonfiction. Sometimes it would be heavily fictionalized, but it was always sort of a story that I came back to. And so, when this event happened in my life, I didn't even think consciously about it. My mother was dying. I was looking after her, and I was writing about it because I'm a writer, and that's how I relate to the world. And it was only afterwards when I went back and looked at those things, because they kind of like kept calling me, in a certain way. When I went back and looked at them, I realized that, this was sort of the pinnacle of the stories that I had been writing. It was where, all of the elements of our relationship kind of came out, and I could talk about them in a more concrete way. And it just felt important to me in a way. It's, again, I go back to I have to write. This was a story I had to write.
The book has a very interesting writing style. So in reading it, it's not quite, it is also fiction. I didn't know that there was a term for it until the launch. This is why you should attend the launches of books that you've enjoyed, and maybe even the ones you didn't enjoy.
Yeah.
Why did you choose this writing style consciously, or was it something that happened because it was in keeping with what you wanted the story to come across as?
You mean like the form?
The free form,
yeah.
The form of the book.
No, I actually, that's sort of my normal style, or, whenever I approach a piece of writing, I think about the form. How should this story be told? And I think about it in terms of how the story looks on the page and how I break up the sentences. So I think I just think of it in a much more free way than I think a lot of other writers do. But that said, I talked about my background being very experimental, and this is sort of what I've always been steeped in. On the one hand, a lot of African American literature, a lot of writing about race and politics and theory, and sometimes, overlaps, and then also this really heavily experimental writing. And there's intersection points, but, I kind of bring them together. Yeah.
Some of the themes. So have you been surprised by how deeply this book has resonated with a lot of people? Did you? I mean, in the sense that it was quite a personal story, but it's had a lot of people that have read this book that I've spoken to could resonate with so many of the processes. Were you surprised by that this book? Or did you knew while writing it that, listen, I have done a great deed?
I don't think anyone does.
You'd be surprised. I had an author on the podcast who I loved it. It was quite refreshing. He said that he wasn't shocked when his books did well, because he respects the process of writing as a craft and as a labor, and because he puts in the labor and the craft, he's never shocked by the results. And I was just like, okay, the next time my imposter syndrome threatens.
Yeah, I was gonna say this is a very male thing to say.
Of course. Of course, maybe you should have that in your next book.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, I wish I could siphon off some of that confidence. Maybe I will later in my career. I think there's different things involved. So first of all is like, when you're writing a book, you don't think anyone will buy it. You don't think it will be published. Then you don't think anyone will read it. And that's because that's what happens to most books. And it's great to have confidence, but I think it might be something towards arrogance if you assume that it's going to be read and adored. Nothing on that guy. That's my experience. So that's one part of it. It's the anxiety of not ever getting attention is one part of it. But then on the other hand, in terms of like how the book has resonated sort of emotionally, I guess maybe that's the part I was less surprised by, because this is how I always write. It's very direct, it's very confessional, and usually when people remark on my writing, it is that I'm just able to be so direct that people are able to identify with it. Yeah.
So one of the most interesting themes in this, one of the most interesting themes is the theme of identity. In the sense that you are an American South African, so you are African American, but not in the way that we think of African Americans. But you're not quite South African in the way that somebody else would think of a South African. And how did you approach the theme of identities? Because you reading this, I felt Thandi battling with her identities and battling with straddling what you've called a double consciousness. How did you approach that?
I think that was one of the things that just came from Thandi being a narrator that's close to me, and I really viewed her with like my own world view here, which is that comes from experience, that it is like I've always had a contingent identity. And so I actually think that it's the way that I think of identity is good. That it's not static, that it's not essentialized, that it changes depending on where you are. That's realistic, and I think, the direction that we're sort of moving towards as a world, where things are blending together so much and things are getting shaken up, I think it actually helps to think of identity at least apart in terms of how we construct it and how we think of it and how other people think of it. That might be even more relevant than, our biology or our genealogy or anything like that.
Relationships feature quite often in this book, and I think we all feel quite strongly about who Thandi lands up with. I was really glad at the launch. Like when people were, I don't want to give away too much of the book because I still want people to go out and get the book.
Yeah.
I just want to pique their interest. But Thandi is this vivacious, interesting, conflicted. She's likable, but only to an extent, because Thandi really does some unlikable things, which is what makes her so interesting as a character. She's just so complex, and she strays quite far from sort of the cardboard images that we've had of black women being, of women of color being one thing or the other. You're either good or you're bad, and there's no room for you to be an interesting person who sometimes does bad things.
Right.
But then she lands up with this very mundane, this man who's just the face of the nice guy.
Yeah.
But not. I was reading at the launch, everybody was like, yes, why?
And then I had to defend him too.
You need to defend him today, because wow. Why did she land up with, why did you make a male character like, Thandi's dad is interesting. He's multi-layered. A lot of the male figures in this book are interesting characters. But she just lands up with this man who is like beige. He's like what beige would be if it was a person.
Yeah.
Why? Was that conscious, or was it just the character came to you and that's what?
No, it was conscious, because, if you kind of go through Thandi's different relationships and escapades, those are always about her trying to find something that she's lost, you know. So when it comes to sex, very often, you know, like the people remark a lot about the threesome scene, and there she's trying to escape. It's almost like she's using sex as a drug. And I think with this character, Peter, she's looking for stability and she's looking for her own family. And something that I've found in my experience and sort of like looking at friends of mine is that that's something that happens a lot. You know, after you lose a parent or like your family is shaken up in some way, you're looking to make another one. And like sometimes it works out and sometimes it doesn't, but it usually comes out of that impulse, and that's what I was trying to portray.
Mental health features in the book, but not in the way that we've sort of, I don't know, that I've seen it written about. I worried about Thandi's mental health just in watching her grieve. I think that she sometimes grieved in ways that were self-destructive. And I know somebody asked you this question about it, if you were worried about them being worried, and this is how you know that you've written a good book, that your readers take it personally, and you know you were all concerned about it. We're all wanting to call Thandi's dad and you know ask him to intervene.
Yeah.
But were you consciously thinking of mental health as a subtext and of how we grieve? We don't often talk about grief. We talk about loss. We talk about illness, you know, but we never ever talk about grief. And I think often people don't even know how to react to grief. We don't know what to say to somebody who's just lost a parent. We don't know what to say to somebody who's just lost their partner. And that awkwardness manifests in how we then interact. So I guess really the question is but did you consciously make that self-destructive grieving an important theme? Because it is, you know, Thandi does things that are just, you're like, you want to shake her, you're just like, what are you doing? Stop.
I you know, that felt realistic to me, again, from my own experience. I think it was part of what I wanted to talk about here, like around the time that this happened in my life. I started looking into a lot of literature about how to process grief and looking into statistics as well. And one thing that, you know, has interested me is that, well, first of all, grief often coincides with like, basically like a temporary sort of depression, right? It's an occasional depression. But it's still a depression. And I think people don't have the understanding that you are temporarily sort of mentally impaired. And what interested me at the time is, you know, in the Black community, we have an issue with mental illness. We have an issue with naming it and seeking help. But the thing is, we experience so much trauma. And so there are all these people walking around in this country and in my country with this trauma and with this unprocessed grief. And it was just important for me to talk about it and like, this is what it looks like. You know, this is, people do those self-destructive behaviors. They'll go out and have sex with inappropriate people and get themselves into dangerous situations and do drugs and drink and everything. And it's actually all part of this process.
So the book also chronicles sort of, I want to not wrestling with one's mortality, but an interaction with your mortality, right? Because when you meet Thandi's mom, you don't ever imagine her being vulnerable in the ways that illness then renders her vulnerable, you know, as the story proceeds. And the book also sort of caused me to ask myself my own questions about how I feel about mortality and illness, and which is something that we don't often talk about. You know, we know that people are sick, but we don't have conversations around end of life. And what are your feelings now? Has the book changed how you feel about mortality, about illness? Have you been forced to just re-look at having had your own interaction that you chronicled in the book?
Yeah, I'm glad you asked that. And it actually, the book is kind of part of a long process, my whole life kind of coming to terms with mortality. So, as I mentioned, I came here a lot through the 90s, the late 80s and 90s. But where I came from, where I was raised in America, was this very sheltered, very white neighborhood. So there's a story in there about, the neighbor across the street who slept with their door open in this really, really secure society. And for a lot of Americans, white Americans, wealthier Americans, they're lived that way, where they're completely insulated from any kind of danger. And their relationship to death is really remote. It's something you don't have to think about. So imagine me growing up and going from that environment, being dropped into South Africa during the 90s. So some of the things that I saw, I had a lot of unprocessed trauma from the things that I saw and the things that happened in my family. So it's actually been a really kind of up until now, a really long battle with myself to not be anxious about it and not be traumatized in certain ways. And writing the book for me was about getting closer to death and being okay with it. So it was actually through the process of it that I started to feel more comfortable.
So I have to talk about this because it's just come up over and over again. So Joburg gets portrayed in the book, and you talk about Maboneng and how, so in the book, Thandi feels quite unsafe in Maboneng, despite the fact that she's never really experienced any personal violence of her own. And there's been some criticism, particularly from South Africans, for how they feel that you portrayed Joburg negatively. You didn't portray South Africa well, whatever that means. How would you respond to that kind of criticism? Because it seems to be something that a lot of some South Africans feel quite slighted about,
Yeah. Well, first of all, I completely understand it, so I don't argue with it. I think, reactions are good and fine, and I'm always open to hearing them. Having talked to people, because when people tell me that, I try to ask them why. And I think my understanding is that it has something to do with the lack of representation of South Africa internationally. The fact that a lot of those representations have to do with violence, and they don't want one more representation, right? So I understand that comes out of scarcity, and I understand how that feels because I'm a Black woman. So I get it. At the same time, I think, again, I'm not, these things happen to me. So, this is something I haven't really said very much up until now. And honestly, I don't like it, but everything that happens in the book happened to either me or a family member. And I'm very close with my family here. As I mentioned, I've been here a lot. The violence in this country has had a very deep impact on my life, and it continues to. So when I write about it, it's out of having experienced it in a way, feeling helpless in the face of it, as I think a lot of South Africans do sometimes. And then speaking to people, being here, and it's just, in my experience, always a topic of conversation. So that's the first part. The second part is, especially in the relation to I think I mentioned in the book, I include a blog post that talks about, how dangerous is South Africa actually. And I loved when I read that. I came across it just wherever, and it's just this academic who sets out, how dangerous is South Africa? And so he goes out and talks to cab drivers, and he's like, how dangerous is it? And it's oh, it's horrible, and it's all the, it's the blacks' fault, it's a black, typical, you find that everywhere. So, and then he asks him, well, have you ever been a victim of violence? And he says, well, no. And so at the same time, I know from being here that a certain amount of it is imaginary. I think it has to do with, first of all, race. There is an association of Black people with violence that exists in America, but also the history of the country, the relative newness of the country, how things have been in flux for a long, the past couple of decades, and that's all just natural. So it's something that coming here very often and having to deal with things happening to family as well, I've had to sort of mitigate it myself. And I don't know, there are certain statistics that it seems like on the whole things have improved a lot. But there is still this issue of the imagination that seems to be really present with us South Africans. It doesn't, like that blog post shows, doesn't always correlate with reality. And that, I think, is what I was interested in exploring, is like
hyper-awareness.
The hyper-awareness, the paranoia, the imagining things is just such a big part of being here, and it's just always stayed with me.
Although I thought it was, I had this conversation with somebody else at the launch, and I said that I felt that people might feel that it was a negative portrayal, but also think that as a woman in this country, you're acutely aware of how unsafe you are at any point, and sometimes I think that we're also very normalized to it. That we hear about someone's partner killing them today and tomorrow it's somebody else and the next day it's somebody else, and there's like a normalization of it that sometimes you need to see it in print to have that I don't know, but sometimes seeing things in writing it shocks you. Like, is this really what happens? Why would somebody who comes to live in this country feel that way? Where does that stem? And sometimes I think it's a little bit too easy for us to necessarily always want to put it down to paranoia or to propaganda or to people wanting to represent African countries negatively. I think sometimes there's an introspection that needs to be done, and I think that this is, in many respects, South Africa's moment for introspection about the violence towards women, about the ways in which we harm women and children in this country, about why a woman can't be in Maboneng and can't be alone and can't feel safe in Maboneng. And that was my personal interpretation of it, and I think I love the fact that it's brought up that conversation. I think we often, I think it's a little bit too easy to want to relegate it to somebody else writing about your country and you're not being positive. I think it's a moment for introspection in general for this country.
Yeah, I appreciate that, and I think personally that's a lot of where it comes from, is that like I'm really outspoken. I'm very independent. I want to travel wherever I want to. I want to say whatever I want to, and I just, every time I've come here, I've had problems either with actual danger or people telling me that I can't do something because of danger. And so my experience here as a woman has absolutely been a lot of why this experience is rendered that way.
Speaking of topics which enraged me, not that I'm biased or anything, but reading about healthcare and the inequalities in the US, even as a person of color with relative privilege, was absolutely enraging for me, even as a reader. Was this one of the more difficult topics to write for you in the book, and why did you think it was important to include it so prominently? Because you can't read this book and then not have your interest piqued about inequalities in health and about the interactions that poorer Black people have with the healthcare system and how that then affects their health outcomes.
Can I ask you why you were enraged? Because we spoke before the interview and you are used to a lot of this. So where does the rage come from?
So the rage for me is just I think the idea that everywhere you go in the world, regardless of how developed you might think a society is, Black people continuously will have the short end of the stick, even when it comes to matters of life and death. And I think that particularly because I see these inequalities in South Africa, it just frustrates me to feel that there's no place of refuge for Black people, that even because the argument is always made, it's a third world country, we don't have money. If we had the money that America has, then things would be better. And then you go to America and things aren't better. We still have money, so structural inequalities continue to hamper Black people's health. So I'm just like, where do we need to move to have some semblance of a healthcare system that works, that doesn't automatically render you disadvantaged because you're black and you're poor. And I don't know, and maybe I'm asking for a lot from the healthcare system, but I do think that healthcare systems are called to be a little bit better. Like, I don't know. I think that's what enraged me, was that everywhere you go, even in what should be the land of the free and is great and is amazing, even then.
Well, first of all, just to go back to a quick tie into the last point. I don't think that I portray America in a positive light.
No, definitely.
And that is one of the primary ways that it's done, is through the racism in the country. But to address that directly, you may be further enraged to learn that Black Americans think that Africa is going to be the refuge, and South Africa particularly because it's so developed. And yeah, I guess there's a bit of disappointment on both sides. Unfortunately, I think this is about power, and it's about people in power diminishing the importance of people who don't have power. It looks different in different countries. I just came from Australia, and obviously, how exactly, and how Aboriginals have been treated in that country is astounding, disgusting. In my country, it's Black people, but also Native Americans. Their issues with healthcare are even worse than Black Americans because of, where they live and etc. I don't have an answer, but I think it is really helpful to think about it in terms of power. There will always be someone on the bottom. There will always be someone on the top. And what our job is, or what needs to happen, or the job of people who are interested in doing it, is to try and close that gap, make sure everyone's treated equally.
So hair features quite prominently in this book, which is interesting for me. I think that Black women have a complex relationship with our hair, and this complexity comes from other people's relationships with our hair. I think that other people's interactions with our hair has been the primary source of the complexity that exists. But also that your hair was, the way the hair was portrayed in this book was a nice metaphor for race relations. Hair seems to be a thing that's making a comeback in this is the second book that I've read where hair is a thing. Where Black women's hair is a thing particularly. Why did you include, there were so many other things that you could have used as a metaphor, our skin, and which you do go into detail, but hair prominently makes an appearance, and we can all relate to having your hair straightened, sitting in the chemicals burning you because there's a look, there's an aesthetic that everyone is going for. See, the fact that Black women all over the world can relate. Continents apart, we all have the experience of your scalp.
Yeah, and you're absolutely right. It's about the expectations that the world places on us. As you can see, I have big old thing of hair on my head. It's like
we will attach a picture of this podcast so everyone can see Zinzi's hair.
Yes, I've always had a ton of hair. It's always been difficult to deal with, and again, this book came out of my relationship with my mother, and that was always a big point of tension between us because I think neither of us were really interested in it that much, but like you say, it's just something that my mother felt like she needed to do so that I would be accepted, and especially for her. Coming to the States as an immigrant from South Africa, a Black immigrant, acceptance was a big part of her life. I've only now realized what a big impact coming to the States had on her emotionally. And so for her it was, I don't think that her opinions about how I should look just seemed like they came straight from the outside world. And I think a lot of times that's what it is. I don't, it can seem cruel. It's physically painful and probably really dangerous. You're a doctor, right? To have those chemicals on you. And I don't think most mothers did it to hurt their daughter, or that wasn't what they were doing. They were doing that because they felt like they needed to
do it,
you know, because they felt like we needed to get a
hair.
job. But it's, you know, good hair is about like finding a partner, having friends, being able to fit in, get a job, go to school, all those things.
But also because good hair looks like different things for different people, right? So when natural hair is being promoted, it would always be hair that looked like yours as opposed to maybe hair that would look like mine, right? And there's some deep politics that are entrenched in that, you know. And even with somebody that has what would be stereotypical good hair in the black community, there was still a bar. And I think that's always the feeling for black people, that the goalposts are constantly shifting, you know. So when you do have the big curly hair, someone still wants to do something to it, you know. And for me, another example of that was colorism, which came through quite strongly in the book, you know. And you've mentioned how so there's a scene where your mother talks about how, well, Tandi's mother, not your mother, Tandi's mother. I think that's something that will happen to you quite often, that people will. But Tandi's mother talks about how a dark-skinned, she'll never have good relationships with dark-skinned women because they'll always be jealous of her, you know. And you've mentioned that you spoke about colorism because you don't believe that a language we're missing the vocabulary to talk about it, because it's a real thing. There's a reason why a Tandi would be seen to be more attractive than a Kelly Rowland, for example. You know? There's aesthetics. There's certain aesthetics that are seen to be more attractive than others. You know, what does the missing language look like for you? Because you've written the book, you've had time to think about it. What would the conversation look like for you?
Oh, I don't know if I'm there yet.
Not
there yet. But I feel like whenever, in my experience, whenever this has come up, it's just something, you know, like you said, you lack the vocabulary. It's something that is automatically so hurtful and divisive between women. So it's almost like if you even acknowledge that the world sees me in a different way than they see you, that is automatically hurtful. Or divisive, or it comes between people. In my experience, and when I've had like relationships that are impacted by it, it usually doesn't get that far. It's just like about feelings, and you kind of just deduce it about something that happened. And my problem with that is, in the same way that I would talk about beauty in general for any women, right? We're constantly talked about and evaluated and treated according to how we look. But there's a sense that it's not something that belongs to us. And that's my issue with it, is that even though it's something that affects us every day, we don't have the language for it, we don't have the vocabulary. So I don't know what it is. I guess, like, you know, maybe just trying first, you know, but like recognizing that it's a conversation that needs to happen, and you need to get past that discomfort phase at some point.
And I think the conversation's also been happening quite a lot on social media, you know. And I think we're also, you grow up acutely aware of, I think that as a people, we're very acutely aware of our skin color. And you're very acutely aware that if you spend too much, if you're dark skinned, if you spend too much time in the sun, you become darker, and that's not a good thing. And no one quite can tell you why it's not a good thing, but you know. And even as adults, a lot of dark skinned women will have that complex about, like, I can't be in the sun too much, you know, because either that, or when people speak about you, they'll fetish you, and it's an important. I found that to be one of the most striking conversations in the book, is that a conversation needs to happen about colorism and the impact that it has, and the ways in which people have to confront their own privilege, and maybe that's why the conversation must happen, right?
Yeah, you know, another thing that's come up since I've been here, because it's been about 4 years since I've been back, which is like the longest I've ever not been here. People started talking about bleaching a lot, you know, and it's just, that is so heartbreaking to me. It's so, you're a doctor, it's so harmful and irrevocable, that change that you make to your skin. And yeah, I think that's just another indication that, like, we need to be able to talk about it.
And talk about it in ways that, I loved how you wrote about how you described the dark-skinned character, the dark-skinned woman in the book, Like Tandy's best friend is dark skinned and she's beautiful, but she's not. You don't describe her complexion as being a foodstuff, right? She's not chocolate. She's not caramel. She's not a Nubian queen. She's a beautiful woman who is dark skinned, and they're not two opposing ideas. And I think this is why it's important for women of color to write about themselves, right? Because the way in which you would describe a dark-skinned woman is completely different to how a white male might write about a dark-skinned black woman.
Yeah, no one's ever pointed that out before. Yeah, I think that's great. Yeah, you're right. It's why things need to be written about from our perspective, because it's like, you know, we're just people to each other.
She was just an attractive person who was dark-skinned, and I didn't have any like pictures of this Nubian queen. Do you know what I mean? It was,
I get it.
It was important to me. Like I read that and I was like, this is important. This is why representation is great. You know. The women in this book are complex. Like they're complex. Like I liked Tandy, but there were times when I wanted to shake her. I was like, what is wrong with you? You know. I liked Tandy's mother as well. Tandy, the women in this book are complicated characters. None of them are completely likable. None of them are completely unlikable. But I mean, you even talk about our own complex characters as well. I mean, Winnie Mandela, who passed recently, for a long time was vilified in this country and was treated quite poorly. You know. In the ways that only a black woman can be treated, right? If she had been a man, right?
Yep, absolutely.
Her legacy would be completely different.
We would accept her wholeheartedly.
Why did you make the women in this book so complex?
I didn't try. I think it's just, you know, as you said before, I'm a black woman. I see black women as whole people. You know, maybe part of the way I was raised is a bit different. Like, you know, I think a lot of women who are my complexion and of my privilege are raised with a lot more colorism and a lot more racism. But my parents always raised me to see all black people in their full complexity and to think that I'm not any different. And that was part of their radical spirit and their political beliefs. But for me, you know, I'm a black woman with South African roots. How could I not think about Winnie? But I'd say, you know, I think she's becoming more important to me now as I get older, and maybe for you too. It's because of just what you said, the way that she was treated before. Looking back on that now with the knowledge I have, you know, after reading feminist scholars and you know, thinking about things in different ways, I can look back on that and I can see all of what's wrong with it. Whereas before, when I was younger, you know, maybe I would have accepted parts of it. But it's a really, you know, she's just a fascinating figure, and she changes, I think, from wherever you choose to view her from, she'll change. But what you said is exactly right. You know, what I was trying to get at with my portrayal of her was, you know, the fact that it feels like a contradiction that we have a woman, a mother, who is also, you know, perhaps took part in some brutality, but when our male heroes, it's accepted automatically, you know. So that's something to think about.
It is. The mother and daughter relationship in this book is quite complex, and we as a community, we have an understanding of father-children relationships being complex and being fraught with some difficulties, but I don't think we fully have an appreciation for mother-daughter relationships being difficult. Did writing this book help you to sort of put together some of, not come to a reconciliation, but I think view your relationship with your mom in a different light, writing about Tandy's relationship with her mom?
Yeah, absolutely. You know, the reason why I've always written about my mom is because I couldn't understand her. And through writing the book, I had to get inside her head, you know, because she is really, Tanya is less so based on me than the mother figure is based on my mother, because my mother was just such a character. And so I just kind of wrote down her story because it's good. And it's like every writer's dream. And I had to, in order to write her as a character, I had to figure out her motivations. And what I learned through that process was that a lot of what she was motivated by was fear of being in America as a black woman from South Africa. And it forced me to have a lot more compassion for what she went through.
How would you describe this book to a stranger? You meet a stranger in an Uber. Yeah.
I have to do this very often. I'm very bad at it.
Okay, let's make it more interesting. You meet a friend from college that you haven't seen in a while, who now says, Zinzi, I've heard that you are now this acclaimed writer. You have been touted as a young Clouder ranking in the making, which is an actual quote that I'm taking from, I Googled you, which is, it's always nice to Google women of color and find those kind of things, right? And this friend then says, Zinzi, I heard you wrote a book. Tell me about your book. What's it about? How would you describe this book to a friend?
I'm really not good at promoting my own work.
It's not even self-promotion. You're telling us about the book.
It's gonna
all the good stuff.
It's okay. I would say it's about a young woman who loses her mother. Also about the sort of attendant issues, their relationship, race, nationality, what else? Healthcare, and all the things that sort of come with it. Yeah.
I think your friend would be happy with this description.
Okay, good.
You have a second novel that has been signed for, right?
It's actually not a novel. It's going to be an essay collection.
It's going to be an essay collection. Yeah. Okay, and when do you plan to? Are you releasing it anytime soon?
2020.
2020.
Yeah, I'm working on it in earnest now. Okay. Finally.
Okay.
Yeah.
Do you feel any sort of pressure having had such great success with What We Lose? I think people call it sophomore curse or something. That they always worry about the follow up to the debut will be held to a higher standard.
Right. I think I might feel that way about my second novel, but part of the reason why I wanted to switch it up is so that I could not feel that pressure. And also I just like writing essays. I like using a different part of my brain. I think, but I'm relatively good at insulating myself from other people's opinions. So I honestly think of it as an opportunity to improve, because while I definitely appreciate all of the accolades and everything, I see the holes in the book and the flaws. A really long biography of an Aboriginal political leader in Australia, and it's sort of an oral history that's told from different perspectives. So I'm really excited about that. I was really excited to go to Australia and learn about Aboriginal culture, and a couple other. Should I do that over?
Sorry.
I'm also looking forward to, whenever I travel, I will pick up a few books, and I'm excited to pick up some literature from here.
Listen to our podcast for more recommendations on South African literature.
Exactly.
So at the Cheeky Natives, we have this very cool rating system. We have a land committee that is chaired by myself and Tlhogonolo. And what we do in the land committee, we don't give writers stars. I mean, what are you going to do with popcorn and stars? We give our writers land. We give our writers land based on how much we've enjoyed their novels.
Great.
So, and so I had a discussion with my partner, the co-chair of the Cheeky Natives Land Committee. And we've decided that based on how much we enjoyed this book, we're going to give you a piece of land that is also going to be that features in the book. This piece of land features in the book, but it's also the kind of land that needs to be given to a woke person, because the current holders of the land have gentrified and done some other interesting things with this land. So we are going to give you, as the Cheeky Natives, Maboneng, which you chronicled in the book. Maboneng is a vibrant vibrant part of the city. It's also a very beautiful part of the city that has been subjected to some gentrification and some other interesting things that only privilege can allow you to do. And it would only make sense that we give this land, when the land committee distributes the land, that we give it to you, Zinzi. We have full faith that you will take care of Maboneng and its people in the way that it needs to. Shout out to the gentrifiers that are doing some interesting things in Maboneng.
I feel so honored.
It is our greatest pleasure to do this, and I'm quite glad that something which features, that we were able to give you a piece of land which features so prominently in the book. And on that note, we just want to say a very big thank you from the Cheeky Natives to you, taking time out of what has been a crazy schedule. Everybody wants a piece of Zinzi, understandably. Just to be on the podcast, and we really, really do appreciate having you on the podcast. We quite enjoyed What We Lose. And we can't wait to see what 2020 brings. But in the meantime, we want to encourage everybody to buy the books. You can get this book everywhere. So we recommend that you go to Bridge Books. You can go to Bridge Books online. Use our code Cheeky Natives and get 10% off the book. Go to African Flavor, go to the Book Lounge, go to Book Capital. You can even get the book online. Just get the book. Please don't ask your friend for a PDF. Don't ask to borrow a friend's copy. Invest in books, and invest in books by people of color. It's important that we grow the canon, and we give rise to our own sort of genres, and in doing so, hopefully, like in 20 years, nobody's children will be saying that there are literary circles which exclude people who look like them, and that's the primary aim. So thank you very much, Zinzi. It's been amazing having you on the podcast.
Thank you so much. I really enjoyed it.